I'd like you to join me in welcoming a terrific panel, which will be augmented by one more person in a couple minutes. We have Fred Kemp from the Atlantic Council. We have Ambassador Miriam Shapiro, who is the Deputy United States Trade Representative. We have the irrepressible Robert Hormats, who until just a couple months ago was the Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs. The title is really long, but it's economic and agricultural and energy, catering. I mean, it's the go-to, everything else. And Fred Hochberg, who is the CEO of Exim Bank, will join us shortly for this discussion. I'd like to start with the news, and then I'd like to move away from this, the news, and into some of these bigger trend issues. And there's one question that's, I sort of came here early for breakfast, and the TVs were on in the breakfast center, and it was all pictures of Ukraine. And Fred, I know you guys follow these issues pretty closely. And clearly, when we talk about Ukraine, we're not just talking about Ukraine as a big country, the breadbasket of Europe, a place that was seen, as mentioned in an earlier panel, as kind of the inevitable newest, biggest component of Europe. But we're really talking about Russia and how Russia is treating the countries around it, and also below that, issues like democracy and governance and so forth. What's your sense of the state of the situation there, and are you worried that it could become much more grave?
Just one explainer first. The Eastern Partnership of the European Union, the 6 states that were involved in the Eastern Partnership, when this first happened, Russia didn't much care. It said, we see NATO as a threat, and this will get to transatlantic trade and investment partnership questions too. We see NATO as a threat, but not the European Union. And then they saw that this was meaningful, that there was an integration into Europe, a move toward the completion of Europe whole and free, started by the George H.W. Bush administration. And this Eastern Partnership was causing deeper integration than they had realized. So they dissuaded Armenia from going forward with threats and cajoling. It seems as though that's now happened with Ukraine as well, and Moldova and Georgia are moving forward. But what's happened is the Russians have drawn the line and that we actually want to rebuild our sphere of influence in a different way, and we're going to start blocking actually the growth of the EU. And this gets to the fact that the world is now about economies and global competition, and it's less about military security. So they've seen this as a threat to their economic sphere of influence, period. So whatever threats, whatever conversations President Yanukovych had with President Putin, they were convincing enough that he decided to back off the association agreement with the EU. He's a pragmatist. He wants to stay in power. He's trying to figure out the best way to do that. Well, he's got to recalculate a little bit now. So he's seen what's going on the streets. Once he actually uses too much power against the people in the streets, he's probably lost. And so I think it's a really perilous period, but you almost have to feel that we're seeing the beginning of the end of the Yanukovych regime, simply because it's losing a lot of its credibility in front of the people. The question is, where does it go? And I think the lesson for us here in this room is that European integration goes forward and has gone forward historically only when the US is also involved. And I think that we stood back from the issues of completing Europe. We decided, this is now something the European Union can do on its own. And I think we're going to figure out that that's actually not going to work, and that we'll have to engage in one way or another with our European Union friends to push this forward. So I am worried about an outbreak of violence of one sort or another. I'm ultimately worried by a split in the Ukraine, where you would have an eastern half and a western half breaking off. I suppose one of the few positive things about what we're seeing is the eastern Ukraine seems to be also quite upset with President Yanukovych, so perhaps one can find some unifying factors here as well.
Let me ask you a question, Bob, and then Miriam, I want to come to the trade news of the past week, and then we'll get into more of the substance of the question. But just following up on this question, 2 of our leading global thinkers in the list of 100 we did were Putin and Lavrov. And this wasn't because we were endorsing every move that they've made, but over the course of the past year, they've really moved quite a bit from, a position of Russia that some people thought was trending towards less relevance and less clout, and via some canny moves with regard to Syria and some other things, there now is a sense that perhaps they're gaining clout, and they're going to play a central role in the Iran deal, and so they may be gaining clout there. Meanwhile, you have this Ukraine issue. Meanwhile, with the Olympics in Sochi, you have the possibility that if they may crack down or they may be heavy-handed in terms of security. Do you think this is a kind of a watershed moment, a big choice for Putin in the direction that he's going because of these countervailing forces?
Well, I think Putin and as you say, Foreign Minister Lavrov have taken a look at the world and really come to a conclusion very similar to what Fred was just describing, and that is there are two things going on, I think, in Russia today that really focus on the economics of the next 5 to 10 years. One of them is that they've come to understand, and we'll get to this in a few minutes, that they can't rely as much on energy to drive their economy, and they certainly can't rely as much on a captive European market, primarily for their natural gas. So internally, they're making changes to reduce their dependence on oil and gas exports and make their economy more efficient. The second thing, and there are a number of structural changes that are underway we can discuss. The second element is that they've also come to conclude that the future of Russia is not sort of standing back from the global system. The US and the EU make a deal while the US and the TPP countries make a deal. They have to be out there proactively trying to strengthen their trade and economic and investment ties with countries in the near abroad, and those are countries on the periphery of Russia. So what they're trying to do, I think, is to underscore to their own people that they have to make changes internally. At the same time, they're doing a number of things to strengthen their ties to the region, and that's true for economic reasons. It's also true for broader geopolitical reasons, that this is part of Russia reasserting its influence. And they also, and I think one of the things that's interesting, to put this in context, if you go back to the '73 war and the Sinai diplomacy, the Kissinger shuttle diplomacy, it was really about pushing then the Soviet Union out of the Middle East. That was really one of Sadat's goals, and that was one of America's goals during the Cold War. This represents, in a curious way, but in a very clear way, a desire by Putin to say, look, this is a region where we not only are sort of peripheral players now, once again, between now and between 1973 and now, we really haven't been major players. Now we're going to get back and play a more assertive role in the region. So they're really trying to combine a number of factors together and be much more proactive on the regional economic scene, but much more proactive in the Middle East. And they're doing it, as you say, in Syria and in Iran, different ways, but nonetheless a much more proactive role, both in the UN and in their bilateral negotiations.
Okay, thanks. By the way, we've just been joined on stage by Fred Hochberg, who holds every major export-import financing record in American history. He's the all-time export-import financing champion of the United States. Exim Bank has...
Where's my mother?
She's speaking into the earpiece.
Oh, okay, good.
But Exim Bank has grown enormously. Their financing has grown. They've broken all the records compared to past iterations of Exim Bank, and it's part of the President's Export Initiative, which has really been one of the great untold or quieter success stories of this administration. Central to that, and Fred, I'll let you get your bearings for a second. Let me turn to Miriam. Central to that, of course, is trade policy. And you heard, well, you didn't hear Miriam, but earlier several people made reference to the fact that the TPP deal was the biggest trade deal going on in the world, and between TPP and TTIP, we have the most active trade regime that we've ever had. And there were moments there in the past couple of weeks where we thought, uh-oh, we're not going to get trade promotion authority, this isn't going to go through the Congress, and then maybe that looked a little better, and then, uh-oh, we've got a problem in the Pacific, and then maybe that looks a little bit better. And although this is the Atlantic panel, in order to understand where TTIP is going, I think we have to place it in the context of where overall trade has sort of made progress in the past week. And so could you just focus on that for a second?
Yes. We had a very good week last week, and I'm bullish. You have to be optimistic in my job, that these various initiatives are going to all come to fruition. They're very different. They're on different timetables, so it's easy to get caught and be, are we up, are we down, where are we going mode. But what's really important is to keep your eye on the long game. And that is, as you said, we have the most ambitious and aggressive trade agenda that the United States has had in well over a generation, if ever. And our goals are not mutually exclusive. So we want a strong WTO, and we saw that happen last week when 159 members were able to agree on a trade facilitation agreement and a number of other measures to help developing countries. It was all along supposed to be a relatively modest package because we didn't want to set expectations too high. But even that, given 159 sometimes very different viewpoints, was a challenge to achieve. But we collectively, we as the WTO, did it. We also admitted Yemen. So next year, this time, we'll be talking about 160 countries. We're also in the end game of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which takes advantage of the fastest growing, most dynamic region in the world today. We have picked up partners along the way. So we now have 11 partners, including Canada, Mexico, and Japan, which all joined within the last year. So in addition to the goal of developing a very high standard 21st century agreement, we're at the same time integrating new members who have joined discussions that started 3-4 years ago. No mean feat. We made tremendous progress at the Singapore meeting that we just had. More work remains to be done, but the ministers all affirmed that we are at the point where we're really in the end game. And so they gave direction to the chief negotiators, what needs to happen the next few weeks, and ministers will meet again in January to chart progress to ensure that everything they've asked for is done. And at that point, again, I think we'll have more good news. Segue over to TTIP. That stands, we have an acronym for everything. So that's the the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP. We started that negotiation earlier this year with the European Union, but after a lot of preparatory work. We didn't just fall into this lightly. It's also not something that we suddenly thought of, or Europe suddenly thought of. This issue has been around for a while. In fact, a lot of people are surprised to find out that we don't actually have a trade agreement with the European Union because they are our largest trading partner. We're talking about a relationship, sum total of nearly $4 trillion. If you include the bilateral trade and also the investment, supports about 13 million jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. Nonetheless, we felt that there's more.
And it's very balanced trade, right?
Yes, very balanced. I mean, we run a surplus on services, we run a deficit on goods, but it's fairly balanced trade. And it's also fairly diversified. So it's a very strong relationship, but we all feel that it could be even better. So we haven't yet tapped the full potential of what we could do if we achieve three things. And I'll just mention them very generally, and I'm happy to go into more detail. The first pillar of the negotiation is to reduce tariffs. Our mutual goal is to seek to reduce all tariffs across the board. And I think that's an important concept to keep in mind. Some are relatively low, others are not. But I'm hopeful that this won't be terribly controversial. I think there's strong support on both sides of the Atlantic for doing that. The second pillar is to increase our regulatory cooperation. And let me be very clear, this is not a deregulatory agenda. Both sides have very strong protections for health, safety, the environment. We're not going to change, Europe's not going to change. But what we can do is look together at ways we can regulate more efficiently, more effectively, without unnecessary costs or burdens on companies, entrepreneurs, service providers on both sides of the Atlantic. So where can we do a better job? So for example, a European auto manufacturer who sets up a plant in South Carolina doesn't have to necessarily have two assembly lines under the same roof, one to produce cars for export to Europe, European cars for export to Europe, and the other to produce European cars for sale in America. Is that something we can do a better job and, again, reduce these unnecessary, what might be unnecessary costs? I don't know the answer, but I know we need to look at this question, and our experts have already started to do that, as well as to look across the board, horizontally, at what we can do to encourage greater regulatory coherence, greater transparency in terms of regulation, greater participation. So we're inclusive, we invite comments on what we're doing as we do now. We continue to do that, Europe starts to do that, and also more accountability. So the regulators need to be accountable to the publics as to the decisions that they make.
Okay, so I want to come back to the trade thing in a second. But let me jump to Fred Hochberg, and then I want to tie the trade thing to the broader relationship. It's a balanced trade relationship, it's a vital trade relationship, but of course, it's also got its competitive elements. And I know that Exim Bank has gone through its travails on the Hill, as certain people have said, oh, we don't need this, and this is, corporate welfare and so forth, and you battled through that because you sent a message that we need to have this institution. One of the reasons we need to have it is because of the Europeans, right? Because there's competition. And you travel all around the world, and that's another dimension of this, is how do we compete with them, and how do they compete with us, and how do we level that playing field? So maybe you want to talk about that.
Sure, and thank you for having me. And sorry, I was actually on the Hill, making sure we get reauthorized next year. Europe is both a customer and a competitor. With the downturn of the global economy, I would say they've become a much more fierce competitor. Germany in particular, when it comes to power plants, infrastructure. Italy's a big competitor in the oil and gas fields. So we face intense competition there. And their export banks have become much more aggressive as a result. One of the things that we're able to do as part of our charter is we can either do a guaranteed loan, which about 80% of what we do are guarantees, and we can also do direct loans when we do, particularly if you're building a large infrastructure project and people looking for fixed rate, 12-year money, very hard, almost impossible to find from a bank. We can provide it. As an example, the Europeans don't like to provide it, so they would like to stop us from providing it. There are a lot of things in our internal politics that we can't do as an export agency. We're not asking them to stop, but they would like to have us stop doing things that they find too competitive for their taste. So the competition with Europe is very great. Since you let Miriam speak, but certainly the competition, and we often talk about China, but Korea and Japan are intensely competitive as well, frankly. So, we are seeing intense competition. When you're building a large, whether it's airplanes, whether it's Airbus and Boeing, which is clearly a toe-to-toe competition, or infrastructure projects, there are a lot of jobs involved. And so their governments are increasingly involved. I would say when our Congress is concerned about the private sector and the free market, it's one thing for U.S. companies to compete with a foreign company. It's something different when we have U.S. companies competing with Germany, Inc., France, Inc., China, Inc., Korea, Inc., and so forth. And that's what a lot of it. Those countries are far more engaged in supporting their exporters and their businesses than we are.
So, in that context, I'm struck listening to the conversations of today that this is kind of not your father's or mother's foreign policy. In other words, we just had a Middle East panel, and one of the points from the Middle East panel was the Israel-Palestine issue was not central. It was not in the top, X number of issues in terms of centrality. Well, for most of the past 70 years, in fact, for most of the past century, the central component of U.S. foreign policy has been the transatlantic relationship. And certainly in the post-World War II era, it was transatlantic collaboration on creating global institutions, transatlantic collaboration in creating the world's most powerful alliance, in dealing with the threats of the Cold War and rebuilding Germany and Europe, that was the foundation, that was the great success story. Europe has had economic troubles, we've had economic troubles. NATO has lost its way in terms of its mission. Certainly it doesn't want to do Afghanistan over and over again. And there is some hope that things like TTIP begin to redefine the transatlantic relationship. They begin a process. And so I want to talk to Fred and Bob, and then we'll go back to Miriam and Fred. Where does this go? Do you think that's realistic? Or is this just clinging to some old paradigm that's not long for this world?
Which Fred? Should I drive?
It's the
reason this needs to get done. It's for strategic reasons that TTIP needs to get done, more than for trade reasons, frankly, and more than even for economic reasons. And let me make that argument. The Atlantic Council is fully behind this in the same way the Atlantic Council was fully behind NATO during the Cold War. It was military strategy that was important then. It was an inflection point in history. We believe we're an inflection point in history again, as important as 1919, 1945, 1989. You see the biggest shift, political, economic, and military influence since the 19th century. We have 18%, US, 18% of global GDP. With Europe, we come close to 50%, which is what we had alone in 1945. So how do we actually shape the future? Well, we only shape the future, and we only really have a short window to do that. So if we don't do it now, we're going to lose this opportunity. If we work very closely together with our partners who helped us create the very benevolent world that we've got right now. And the battlefield is economic, it's not military. So you need economic security, not military security. If you put TTIP together with TPP and negotiate both of these out, you have 65% of the world economy, and that means the rest of the world economy comes along. You have then set the stage for a world that we would be happy to live in, even as our relative weight in the world declines. And so TTIP is crucial in this new world that you're talking about, where we have to adjust the way that we operate. Conversely, if we don't get TTIP done, we've raised expectations for it, and we could be in a worse situation if we had not gone down this path to start with. So it's crucial that we get it done, and there's also a really big downside if it doesn't get done.
So, but here, you know, when we were building the Transatlantic Alliance the first time around, there was a common enemy. There was a reason for everybody to pull together. There was a reason to have interoperability. There was a reason to have communication among chains of command, because we were facing Soviet Union. Now, Europe itself seems barely able to hold itself together. The divides between northern countries and southern countries, richer countries and poorer countries, countries that are more inward-looking and countries that are more aggressively outward-looking, seems to be growing. Can you have a future of a transatlantic alliance with a Europe that's in the midst of an identity crisis?
Well, I think you could make the argument that one of the imperatives for this is that Europe is facing all these internal challenges that you've described, and that one thing that might pull some of these countries together, both the big exporters and the more outward-looking countries, I assume you have Germany in mind, and the Low Countries and some of the Scandinavians, and then the others who are focusing a lot more on their internal problems. But there is an argument to be made for this on the grounds that it would help the Europeans to pull themselves together in order to focus on the opportunities of a trade negotiation and a trade deal with the United States, because it would help all of them, although some more than others. And I think one of the interesting elements of this is, if you go back just to the point you made a moment ago, if you go back to the early Cold War period, the United States looked at trade as a way of reinforcing its security relations with Europe. It was a way of helping European reconstruction. It was a way of dealing with the fledgling European community, which was just beginning to build itself over a period of time. The Kennedy round was really the vehicle for doing this. What I think is important now is at a point in time when NATO is, particularly for younger people, both less an imperative and less recognized as something that's important because they don't really know the background of NATO. Why is it there in the first place? What is it doing? Its record in Afghanistan was not exemplary in the minds of many Europeans or Americans. So you need something to pull the US and Europe together on a geopolitical and sort of a geostrategic basis. And this, I think, is an excellent vehicle for doing this. I think, however, that unlike the period of the 1960s when we did the Kennedy round, it can't just stand from a public point of view on political grounds or security grounds. It has to pass muster, as Miriam pointed out, on economic grounds, because they're the two committees in the Congress who are doing it, Ways and Means and Finance, but it also, to Americans and Europeans, has to be valid economically. If you can get something that's valid economically and serves the common interests of both sides in terms of jobs and growth and opportunity, which it has to do in order to get the kind of public support it needs, then the added dimension, and I think Fred's right, a critically important one is that it strengthens geopolitical ties as well at a time when NATO is less important in doing that. And the third element is if you can get the kind of common standards or similar regulations so that people don't have to make cars for a European market and the American market, it's a way that we can export high quality standards to other parts of the world. Whereas if we don't have an agreement where we can reach common standards or agreements on common testing and things of that nature, then other countries, other big countries to our east, can sort of pick us off. If we have one standard amongst us, then we can export that, and that gives us a lot more influence in the WTO and in other negotiations. So I see a multitude of reasons why this is important, and the timing is correct. If we don't do it now, we're not going to have this opportunity.
Okay, well let's talk about the timing, because it's one thing to start a negotiation. Typically, when you start a trade negotiation in one administration, you're essentially conceding that the next administration is going to close the trade negotiation. They tend not to happen fast enough to happen within an administration. This is big and it's complicated, and Congress is dysfunctional, and it doesn't get much done on a good day or in a good year, and you're going to be asking for big asks with regard to Trade Promotion Authority and big asks with regard to TPP arguably, and we haven't even talked about generalized system of preferences, so there's a lot of stuff ahead of it in line. Is it realistic to think that any real progress can be made on this? I know you're going to say yes, but then let's pretend we're just friends here. That we can really make any real progress in the course of the remainder of this administration? And if so, what would that look like?
So, David, I mean, it's been less than 1 year of this administration, second term, so we're talking about more than 3 years. I think we can do an awful lot in that time period.
Okay, 3 years in a month. You have 3 years in a month.
Yeah, I mean, we've gotten very encouraging signals on TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, from Chairman Camp and Chairman Baucus. So we could see TPA emerge from Congress in the first part of the year. Keep in mind, we don't actually need TPA until we're ready to submit trade agreement to the Congress. We are ways away with respect to TTIP, closer, obviously, with respect to TPP. The European Commission, I think what's the interesting dimension of this is that the European Parliament has elections in May, and then, of course, the European Commission, the current Commission, goes out in the fall. So it's no secret that the current Commission would like to see this done. That's probably a tad ambitious, but at least to see as much as possible done before they go out in the fall. What we've said is we will work as quickly and intensively as Europeans are prepared to. At the same time, there's no artificial deadline, and it's the substance that's going to have to drive how quickly we get there. We have the third round starting on Monday in Washington. We've made very good progress so far. We've also had a lot of preparatory work that laid the ground and convinced us that the time, as Bob said, was right to launch. So yes, it's an ambitious undertaking, but I think it is doable, certainly doable. Will it happen? None of us can predict, but I can tell you that we're going to work as hard as possible to make sure that we cross the finish line, and we do embody this agreement for the economic reasons we've discussed, and also for the political and strategic reasons. It was Secretary Clinton, I think, who described TTIP as an economic NATO. And while I can tell you that was not the reason we launched, we really did it for the economic benefits that we believe will be immense for both sides. Essentially, it was the President's focus, continuing focus on jobs and growth that had driven us to embrace not just TTIP and TPP, but also a number of initiatives that are ongoing in the WTO. It's that fundamental focus on jobs and growth, strengthening the middle class in the United States, that other leaders have as well. Dealing with unemployment in Europe, dealing with unemployment here. The numbers are different. We're doing better now, but it's a common challenge that people have. And it's something that we think TTIP can, we hope address. So I think it helps unify Europe, which is a derivative benefit, because a lot of countries come to see me and negotiate with the Commission in Brussels, but doesn't keep the member states from having opinions or coming to visit or are going over there. And not a single one has said, we don't want this. In fact, they're almost trying to convince us that they want it more than the others. And why? And why it's going to be good for Portugal. Why it's going to be good for the UK. Why it's going to be good for Germany. And I could go on. So it's something that I think has actually helped to unify Europe and deal with some of the challenges.
It may keep the UK in the European Union. I mean,
some say that.
You mean as a carrot?
Well, I mean, would they really want to leave a European Union that's about to be part of the biggest trade and investment deal that's ever been done? And so the referendum is a bit further out in the EU when it would have, if it happens, it would be a bit further out from where you could see whether this is happening or not. So the two could influence each other. Your question to the future of Europe as and how it's influenced by this.
Let me ask you a question, Fred. And I asked this question with a bit of hesitation because I really don't want a big advertisement for the President's export initiative, but a little one, because the President went and, was it 3 years ago, in the State of the Union said, I want to double our exports in 5 years. I want to focus on trade and trade promotion, the other things. And I think I've told you this. I was sitting at home watching this, and a reporter for a major newspaper called me up the moment after the words exited his mouth and said, "What the heck was that? Where is that going to come from?" And she was pretty incredulous that he was making this big progress. And then the first year, growth was 16 or 17%. The second year, it was 16 or 17%. There was real progress, and it is part of this jobs initiative. Is it working? Can the goal be achieved? Is this something where the momentum can be kept forward? Because I just don't think it gets talked about very much.
As you correctly said, the first couple of years we were growing at 16% and running ahead of schedule. We've had a lot of headwinds in the last 18 months, particularly out of Europe in terms of that slowdown, which is not anticipated. The last 12 months, exports grew 10%, so that's at a lower than a rate than you would double. But right now we're up in the high 40s from 2009, the base year. I've tracked it. About 25 out of the 50 states will have doubled, either have already doubled or will double by the end of the 5-year period. In about 70 countries, we will have doubled. So I think if you look, it's not going to be across the board, but when I look at it country by country, state by state, industrial sector by industrial sector, there are many that this is really coming in strong. But it isn't as quite across the board as initially hoped for. But partly I just think the global economy, no one here, President Obama, but no one is happy with the rate of growth in the global economy. Even our economy had a great quarter, 3.6%, but it's still, we're not having the kind of recovery that would have been expected after this financial crisis. Europe is still limping along. I mean, Mike Furlan always used to say they're muddling along, and they're muddling along, and they're talking about 1.1 or 1.2% growth. That is certainly a challenge. I mean, about a quarter of our exports go to Europe, so that's certainly not been a very strong area. But So I would say, yes, it's working. Is it, it's not a pass-fail. It's not pass-fail. It's working in a number of areas, a number of segments. It's not working completely across the board.
So Bob, we seem to be, though, approaching a telling moment. Europe is growing at 1% or something like that. Next year, we might grow 2.5%, we might grow 3%. It's quite possible, despite a lot of doomsday scenarios, that the United States will be the most robust, fastest growing large economy, developed economy in the world next year. And one consequence of that could then be the Fed following through on its tapering, which could push up the US dollar, which could have a real impact on all of this. So far, for the past few years, they've been in a hole, we've been in a hole, everybody has been loosening because everybody had a common interest in it. What happens when our interests diverge? When we don't need the liquidity bath the way they still do? Do you see that as a potential tension point in the relationship?
Oh yes, I think with Europe and with a number of emerging economies, as you alluded to earlier, and that is the irony of all this, getting to Fred's point and then to yours, is that one key factor in determining the rate of growth of exports, I'm talking about net now, but you can make a broader argument, is that it may well be that we grow at a more robust rate, in part because of underlying force in the American economy, in part because of the energy boom and all the implications of that. We could be growing very rapidly. We could be growing in the threes. Some economists are predicting we'll continue, maybe not at 3.6, but in the early threes. And that sucks in a lot of imports. And other countries who are growing less rapidly and in part are suffering a withdrawal of capital because interest rates pick up in the United States and some capital that was going to these countries may actually come to the United States. That helps the economy because American companies borrow that money. But the other side of it is pushes up the dollar. So we may have stronger domestic growth, higher interest rates, a stronger dollar, which works against our export-oriented goals, but net is beneficial to the American economy. So I think one shouldn't look at the export objectives as separate from a lot of these other factors. It may well be our export goals are not met or met with greater difficulty, but we're in such a strong position internally because of stronger demand, because of capital coming into this country, that while we're sucking in more imports and exporting less because domestic demand for the products we make is growing, then we may not meet the export goals, but we're better off as an economy. And I think this is one of the things we have to look at, because exports depend to a substantial degree on relative growth rates and on relative exchange rates. And we may see higher growth and an exchange rate that works against some of our export goals, but we have more jobs and we have more growth, and therefore we're better off even if we haven't met those goals.
Okay, David, there's one X factor that I think we should throw in here, and that's energy. And if you're looking at the cost of energy in the United States versus Europe right now, it's about a third for manufacturing. And there's a sucking sound of manufacturing from the world to the United States, which is a very good thing for the United States and for employment and all of that business. But at some point in this trade agreement, in these negotiations, it could influence the way Europeans look at this. And it could cause some issues with that. Shouldn't, because people will gain jobs all over the place. It will be, we've done a study in the US of all 50 states, and there'll be 750,000 new jobs if this TTIP goes through as imagined. And then just very quickly, your question of whether this can get done. My view is if the president is engaged, and if he can get Democrats to vote for it, it will get done. Because I don't think this is an issue where Republicans will decide to undermine the president. I think this is an issue where Republicans are much more likely to vote for than Democrats. But because of the high labor and environmental standards of Europe, this is easier to get done than TPP. The problem I see is Trade Promotion Authority and TPP being in line ahead of TTIP, because I think it's going to be harder to get Trans-Pacific Partnership through Congress than it is the transatlantic.
And
History,
if Trade Promotion Authority
Yeah.
goes off the track, it's like a train going off the track in a tunnel.
And the history of
Everything
every-
after it is not going to
The
be
history of
around.
every trade negotiation the United States has succeeded in has been that you need presidential leadership. The Kennedy round was Kennedy, but more importantly, LBJ. Presidents have to go out and sell it in a broad context and use their political capital to get it through. That is something we know, and the president is enthusiastic, and I think will understand. Miriam is really one of his key advisors in this area. He understands, I think, that he has to play that role when push comes to shove,
Okay.
if it does.
Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go and we're going to ask some questions, and we can ask questions on Russia, we can ask questions on Europe, we can ask questions on Turkey, we can ask questions on political issues, we can ask questions on economic issues, and I'd like you to think about those. I'm going to ask one more question. I want to ask you, Fred, one more question before I go out there and we start doing that. And that is, oh, David, do you have a microphone? Okay, well, no, it's fine. Just you hang on to it, and then you can go around for a bit.
We may both answer it.
Whatever you say, Fred, we're both going to answer.
I know what question I'm going to ask, and I'm pretty sure you're going to answer. But you know, it has to do with NATO and the security partnership.
Yeah.
You know, we saw a vote here where 1 out of 5 people thought there's no way to save NATO, and the majority of people thought it was either no way to save it or it's going to take massive restructuring to save it. We've had some experiments, and out of theater, they go into Afghanistan. Nobody particularly liked that. We didn't like it. I mean, you know, it was not a particularly good experience. And now we're in a situation where when it came to Syria, when it's come to some other things, most of Europe is leaning back. We're even leaning back a little. We'd like to have somebody do some of the burden sharing, but for the most part, nobody's doing it, with the strange exception of the French, who are stepping up in 1 or 2 places. But again, where you see conflict on the horizon, in Africa, a lot of potential conflict on the horizon, the French are already on the record sounding a lot like Americans and saying, we do not want to be Africa's sheriff, right? We don't want to go in and have to clean up everything. Are we in an inevitable downward spiral of transatlantic security cooperation? Because what makes an alliance is an enemy, and we don't have a clear enemy.
If we don't, and I agree with the poll, restructure NATO, and no one seems to be bold enough to do that at the moment, we see TTIP as an economic NATO. So these are now the new threats. We have to come together, just as we reinvented the way we did multilateral cooperation for security with NATO, we have to do that now for the economy. So what do we do about NATO in the meantime? Well, first of all, you have to take on new threats. And so we're in a bunch of cyber wars all over the place. And so if NATO can take on things that are really crucial, like cyber, then you could bring people back together again.
Do you see any evidence of that?
Yes, on cyber you do see evidence going forward. What's harder is we have global partners. 13 of them came to the Chicago summit last year. We've got a summit in September of 2014 in the UK in Cardiff. And some of our most capable military partners are not NATO allies, but they're partners of NATO. You had 50 countries involved in Afghanistan. Afghanistan's going to end. How do you actually keep these partners engaged? And so we see the NATO summit in 2014 in England as a way to kind of redefine NATO, where you could give your global partners not just an ability to fight alongside you, but actually talk about their own issues, which they can't do right now. So Australia can't actually come to NATO and talk about problems in their part of the world. Japan can't do that. And so one has to rethink NATO so that it becomes more of a global security system, where NATO is the hub of different security systems around the world. And then you could revive it, but it's going to take the kind of vision and leadership for NATO that we are not seeing just yet. But if you could actually move forward a new way of economic relationship, a new way of security relationship at the same time in 2015, you could really see a revived transatlantic relationship where all the naysayers about whether the transatlantic world is over would be corrected.
And who's going to provide that leadership?
Yeah, that's the issue without a crisis on the NATO side. I think on the economic side, you do have a situation where the U.S. could provide it. I think if one can get in one's head that this could be a mega moment for transatlantic, if you put these two things together, you might actually get the White House and the President moving forward on that. because he is thinking about legacy. And TTIP and TPP is a big piece of legacy. But if you actually could revive the security element of the transatlantic relationship, which is the core of security relationships in the world, at the same time that you're doing the economic relationship, that's a big idea that one may be able to enthuse. They've got a summit anyway, so they've got to do something at the summit.
David?
Yes.
I would add that we should not forget that these are immensely flexible and creative institutions that we're talking about, NATO and the European Union. The topic is transformative trends. So I began thinking earlier today about 25 years ago, at least when I first joined State Department. I hope I'm not dating myself too much, but it was in the late 80s. The Cold War was still raging. At that time, we were struggling within NATO with the concept of burden sharing, which was a new term. Nobody, I think, ever heard of it. But we realized that dwindling resources were going to be a problem even back then. And then a few years later, unfortunately, we had the bloodiest war to rage in Europe in 50 years. And suddenly there was a greater need and understanding of what NATO could do, not always as NATO, but essentially as NATO forces. So if you look back, I mean, I don't think anyone in this room could have predicted exactly what NATO would be today, exactly what the EU would be today. When you think about all the members that back then were part of the Warsaw Pact or not aligned, these are very adaptable institutions. And we, of course, as the United States, play a leadership role in one, more of a collegial role with the other. TTIP, I hope, will cement the latter relationship. But I think it's important to keep this in mind as we grapple with this very question.
Libya
Okay,
also.
then I'm going to go to the audience, so please be ready with the question. Okay.
Just one sentence. Libya also provides a glimpse of the future. Whether or not you like what's happening on Libya on the ground now, the military operation
I
is
can
interesting.
speak for the group when we say we don't.
Yeah, but the military operation was an interesting one because you had consensus in the region, you had support from the United Nations, you had a NATO-led operation where the U.S. was not in front but was crucial, and so you had a regional organization, an international organization. You had NATO as the actor, with not all members of NATO present and acting. And so, whether or not Libya was the right place to test that could be a place, and your global partners, UAE, others, Sweden, not in NATO, but present in the air there. So it's an interesting model to study from a future of NATO standpoint.
Okay, so I'm going to go to questions, and I see a couple here.
All at the same table.
They're all, well, that table asks a lot of questions. But that's okay. Go on over to the table, and why don't you go to this fellow here has not asked a question yet, and then we'll hand it over to the ladies who have. So, by the way, David Wertheim, who's just walked over here, I just want to say, founded a company called Tea Leaf Nation, which grabs information off of Chinese social networks and leading Chinese thinking. And it's been very successful. We just bought it and are folding it into our broadening cover of Asia. We've established an Asia channel. They have an office in Hong Kong, so we now have an office in Hong Kong, and we're broadening. And he'll play a role in asking questions in the next Asia panel. But I wanted to give him a shout out because he's a new part of our team. Thank you. So go ahead.
Hi, Mark Ribbing with the Department of Defense. I want to ask a question that relates to both security and to economics, and that's about demography. What do you see as being the consequences of relatively low birth rates and some of the other concerns that have been written about and discussed a lot regarding the NATO countries generally, not unanimously, but generally, and particularly Russia? What do you see as the consequences for both security and economics and I guess also for politics generally? Do you see, for example, increasing openness to immigration? Do you see tensions? Do you think this is just not such a big deal? Do you think it is a big deal? What do you see as some of the ramifications for the changing demographic profile of Europe? Thank you.
Okay, when you sit down, just hand the microphone to the global thinker to your right, who is from the country closest to Europe that's not part of Europe. So, who wants to answer that question?
I will.
Go ahead.
Interestingly enough, Russia today has increasing demographics. which a lot of people don't know. I'm not suggesting you're in that category, but a lot of people think Russia has a declining birth rate like many other countries, but it's actually very proud of the fact that it is increasing its population, and it's not due to immigration. I think the US and Russia have yet to figure out the economic puzzle. We worked very closely together to enable Russia to join the WTO. After 18 years of negotiations, we closed that chapter 2 years ago. And now we're working with Russia to make sure it implements its commitments. It's also very interested in joining the OECD, and it's in the process of working on the different pieces of that. But similarly to the question of US-Europe a few years ago, we both have a sense that we haven't yet figured out how to maximize the trade and investment potential between both countries. I think it's great. If you look at the trade numbers today, they're relatively low. We actually had a meeting earlier today with First Deputy Prime Minister Igor Shchevala, who is in town. And we had really a frank discussion about what we might be able to do together and some initial ideas. And we're both going to work hard in the next few months and see what might be possible. But it's something that has a lot of potential, and we still have to figure that out. So your ideas would be most welcome in that regard.
Go ahead.
My question is really one about dealing with poverty at its most extreme. Because I'm thinking very much of not only the growing gap or trying to help the middle classes so much as actually helping those at the lowest rung, the most, like the entirely disenfranchised. The way that it's being dealt with in the UK, which I think is quite disastrous, is through various forms of cuts in benefits, which is having the opposite effect of just making people worse off. And I'm just wondering, since it seems like, it feels like something of a time bomb in both places, both here and in Europe and the UK. I'm just wondering what, if anything, can be done to sort of stem that before it gets any worse.
Thank you.
I'll just jump in. I think in that question and in thinking about what might bring the US and Europe together is we still underestimate the forces of competition and how that is. And as this workforce in the United States gets more competitive, aided by lower energy costs, that helps bring more people to the middle class. It increases exports. It employs more people. We can be, and Europe has that potential. They need to sort of address that head on. And I'm not a Europe expert, but it takes a lot of both political and voter confidence to face the fact is that we're in a much more competitive world. If there's anything that might bring, from a trade and a perspective, U.S. and Europe together, is understanding that, I think Bob said it well, if we don't set the standards, other people will set it, and they will be following. So, I mean, China is a huge competitor. I mean, just in the OECD, since Miriam mentioned it, take all the G7 countries together, and China, India, and Brazil put more money behind their exports than all the G7 combined. And China, by the way, outdistances the other two enormously. So they are running at full blast, and we're still wondering whether we have to compete in some ways. And if we compete, that's how we're going to put more people to work. That's how we're going to be able to raise living standards and get more people entering the middle class and moving up that ladder.
Fred 1 to Fred 2.
One of the great successes that I think we should take some credit for with our allies, European allies, is post-Cold War globalization, where the gap between rich and poor countries has been closing. And so you actually have a situation where if you're looking at China, 6 of the 10 fastest growing countries in the world are African right now, Latin America. You have some real success stories out there. Countervailing, income gaps within countries are growing, whether in China, whether in the United States, whether wherever else. And that causes some real political difficulties, exacerbated by some of the things you're talking about, competitiveness, jobs going elsewhere, and that sort of thing. So it's a political backlash to a situation that overall, globally, is pretty good in terms of countries moving along. So we have to deal with that. The other thing is we have to deal with it well, and we have to deal with it with a somewhat dysfunctional political system right now. or we're not going to be a model for the rest of the world. Europe and the US have always been a model. People want to be part of it. People are on the streets in Ukraine fighting riot police so they can join the European Union. I mean, think about that for a minute. You know, carrying a European flag, I mean, that's quite interesting. And
Thinking about being in the position where you're fighting to join Europe.
Yeah, the big,
After everything they've been through.
Can I add one footnote to what Fred has said? I think there are two related issues here, going back to your question. One is the widening income gap, which has been exacerbated by the financial crisis, but which was occurring even before the financial crisis made it worse. Relatively well-off people have done reasonably well in the aftermath. Many people in lower income groups have not, in part because the educational system in many of these countries doesn't afford them the opportunity. The other is that smaller companies that would otherwise hire people can't get capital to do it because there are real capital availability constraints. The second part of the problem, which is less focused on, but in a way more troublesome, particularly about our own country, but others also, is upward mobility. A lot of studies have been done very recently that show that it is much harder today, for a number of reasons, for people born into low income groups to move up the economic ladder into middle class or higher income groups. That had been a hallmark of the dynamism of America's economy for many, many decades, really since Benjamin Franklin and the early founding of our country. It's become more troublesome, in part for educational reasons, in part for a number of other structural reasons, and in part because it's a lot harder from an economic point of view, and also because of international competition for people to move out of low-income groups because they don't have these industrial jobs that in the past enabled them to propel themselves into the middle class. So we have to focus on both those challenges. And Europe has similar sets of problems, not exactly the same, but not very different. And one of the worries about Europe is that if you don't deal with unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, it could lead to major polarization of societies within countries, not just the North-South gap, but widening gaps between groups within societies, particularly in Southern Europe. So it is a major challenge. You're absolutely right to point to it.
Okay, was there one more at this table? And then we're gonna get one or two more, and we've got 6 minutes.
My question to the panel is about Turkey and what is really the conversation today about Turkey joining the EU, particularly in the context of the fact that on the one hand, you know, a diminishing demographics, young population, labor force, etc., and then on the other hand, in Turkey, declining human rights, problematic sort of situation post the summer, and so on. I mean, what is the conversation today on that?
Okay, thanks very much.
Just one word on Turkey. I think Turkey is critically important as a swing factor. It's between the two parts of Europe, Eastern Anatolia, and then the western part of Turkey. So it's trying to figure out what role it wants to play. Domestic politics in Turkey have different views on that. And the second is, it's really a critical juncture between Europe and the West and the Middle East. It's playing a very active role, one of the most effective roles of any country in the Middle East, especially small Turkish companies. So one of the things that's very important, I think, is that while Turkey has to work out what it's going to do with the European Union, that the United States engage much more actively in strengthening the potential opportunities for trade and investment between Turkey and the United States. Again, it's a country where there's a lot of potential for stronger economic relations, but I think both sides would agree that we haven't been able to develop those economic ties, those trade ties, as much as we might. There's close relations. Turkey has a lot of business groups like chambers of commerce and things. We've been working very hard. Our chamber has been working very hard, but we need to take greater advantage on both sides, the Turks and the Americans, of strengthening our trade ties. And USTR has been working on this very substantially, but there's a lot of potential there, and we need, whatever Europe does or doesn't do, we need to do a lot more to strengthen our economic ties with Turkey.
We work very closely with Turkey and have a major summit there every year with heads of state and government, et cetera. So Turkey has approached us, Turks have approached us in the last year on two really interesting issues. One of them is they're worried to death about TTIP, and they don't want to be left out of this, and they're trying to figure out some sort of parallel negotiating track. The second thing is they came in and they said, look, can you put us together with some major US companies, because we're getting out-competed in Africa, and we need a major US companies to team with us because they're offering 30-year loans at 2% per year, and we can't do that. So they're actually wanting to work together with us on the world stage. And I would say on the Turkish EU issue, the EU really missed a window of opportunity where it would have been relatively easy to put Turkey on a membership track, and it would have been the geopolitically smartest thing you could have done. Bob Hormats talked about...
Are you saying choosing Greece over Turkey doesn't look in retrospect like a great choice? Or?
Greece was already in when this question got a lot of attention in the 90s.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. But Bob Hormats talked about
Cyprus, on the other hand.
Let's just say, if you're talking about swing factors, which Bob talked about, Ukraine is a swing factor, Turkey's a swing factor.
Yeah.
Which way they go determines a lot about the future of Europe and Europe's geopolitical.
Right.
Critically important. So just one last thing on Turkey. I think the issue now is, will the EU join Turkey rather than whether Turkey joins the EU? And for their geopolitical place in that part of the world, they really should be reaching out to Turkey every way they can right now.
I think that question shows in part the transformative power of trade. And I didn't have a chance to answer the question about poverty, but I think if you think about the potential that trade has had to help lower income economies develop, I mentioned the agreement we achieved at Bali on trade facilitation. By just lowering the cost of cross-border trade by double digits, we're creating billions of dollars in potential growth, especially among developing countries. But by the transformative power of trade, I also mean what TTIP has done, along with TPP, in terms of other countries waking up and saying, wait a minute, how do I fit into this picture? And we're very much interested, as I mentioned with Russia, with Turkey in deepening and strengthening our partnership. They're interested in TTIP. They want to be in the loop. They'd like to join. They've said that publicly. At this point, it's a bilateral relationship and complicated enough in that regard. But I also mentioned with regard to TTIP, there are 3 pillars. And there's tariffs, there's non-tariffs. There's also common emerging issues of concern. So it's the US-EU ability to look at challenges around the world that we are facing in terms of trade investment and figure out what rules can help address those. They're not going to bind third countries, but third countries we hope will take notice of how we deal with state-owned enterprises, labor issues, environment issues, localization measures that tend to favor local producers of IPR or goods and services over international providers. So the transformative power of TTIP, I think, is something that Turkey, as well as other countries, are noticing, and they want to be part of the discussion, part of the dialogue. And there may down the road be a role for that. It's too soon to tell.
So it looks like Turkey is going to be the last topic on this discussion. I know you've spent some time in Turkey and done a lot of work there. Do you want to add a last word before
We've done, most of our work in Turkey has been a lot in aircraft. Turkish Airlines wants to be a global airline and joins other airlines like Etihad and Emirates and Qatar all think they're going to be the global airline and create the global hub. There are about 5 of them right now competing for that. We've done a number of power plants in Turkey. We'd like to do more renewable energy there, but Turkey is sort of not in the same place that, say, India and South Africa are, and really embracing a drive to renewable energy. In Turkey, at least our experience with Turkey is hyper concerned about its trade balance. I mean, when I was there, they have a $5 billion, when I was there last, $5 billion deficit with the US. All they wanted to talk about was erasing that, and I said, my goodness, if our problem was as small as $5 billion, we'd be cheering. And they are just consumed by that trade deficit that they have. So it's been strong. It's been one of our stronger countries. We identified 9 key markets. It's one of the stronger ones. And India has, as an example, was stronger, but it's certainly fallen off in the last 12 months. We'll have to wait for that election. So Turkey's a good place to go.
Okay. Well, there were clearly a lot more questions. Unfortunately, there's not a lot more time. We've got a break now for 15 minutes, and then we're going to come back. We've got a terrific Pacific panel before the Secretary comes and speaks. Some really, really great folks. So it's going to continue the high level of discussion we've had throughout the day. Before you take your break, though, will you please join me in thanking this really excellent panel for being here?